Hi everybody, on today's video we're going to do a full Webflow build of this landing page from start to finish, including a little bit of interaction, including making it responsive. Now this video is a part 2 of the Figma tutorial where we designed this page. So if you're interested in learning how to design the page in Figma, you're welcome to check out that video and we'll link it below this video. In this tutorial, we're going to assume that you have the basic fundamentals of Webflow. This is a good walkthrough for beginners, but we do assume that you have a little bit of grasp of the fundamentals. If this is your really the first time using Webflow, I do encourage you to watch. We have a complete workshop, how to finally understand Webflow, where we cover the real fundamentals. But assuming that you have your basics down, this would be a really great walkthrough for you. If you're interested in following along, you can download the resources to work along with us, and we'll link those resources in the description below. With that said, let's dive right into it. So I am working from this Figma project that if you want to have access to it, there's a link below in the description. And I went ahead and exported all of the assets here. So these images, for example, we want them without the background. So we're exporting them as PNG at 2x so they would look fantastic on Retina display. I have the images exported right here. And I'm heading into Webflow and opening up a new project, clean project. Now, usually on big websites, big projects with multiple pages, I'm starting from our style guide, a Kickstarter project, which is also linked below. But this one, I want to get right into it. And it's also kind of like one pager, what we're building right here. So I'm just going to start off from a blank project. And let's start off with setting the default properties. So the first thing is the background, right? This has a background of this dark color, and I can see it by clicking the Figma file and this fill color. So I'm just going to copy that, and I'm going to go here and set the default on the body. So this is the biggest tag here, and whatever I set to it is going to apply to everything inside of it. So I'm going to click here and edit the body tag for all pages so that if we have other pages on the website, they're also going to inherit these properties. And I'm scrolling down into the background color and pasting this color. So now we have this dark blue purplish. The next property that I want to set for the entire page is actually the font that we're working with. And that is an outfit font, which is a Google font. Now in Webflow, we have here on the typography, a bunch of Google fonts, but I can't see outfit in here, so I'm going to click add fonts, and let's load them up from the Google fonts here. So I'm going to type outfit and I can see it here. Now basically what we need here in the Figma file, I can see that we need the bold font, right? We need the bold, and I think we need the regular, and this might be semi-bold or something like this, semi-bold, right? So let me load up 500. So this is 400, 500, and 600. I think these are going to be the regular semi-bold and bold. Let me go ahead and add these fonts, and they've been added. So I can actually go back into the designer and reload. Let me see if this has actually loaded this into the project. So I'm going to select the body tag again, body all pages, and now let's go into fonts. And now we have outfit over here. So outfit normal, let's say 14%. Let's see what we have for the default text size is actually 18%. 18 pixels, sorry. So let's go here into 18 pixels. So now we have the defaults, typography and color. And actually, we also want the type color to be white, right? So now we have the default setup. And now it's time to start structuring this. So you might see that we have different sections here. We have the first hero section, and then we have these featured section, and each one of these is a different section. And for organizational structure, we're going to put them actually inside sections. So we have the section here, which is basically just a normal, div block that just holds content inside of it, but I can give it a name like hero section. And this is going to be helping me to see on the left side in the navigator what we have here. Now, if you might remember from our Figma tutorial, the first thing that we did was to create this grid that's going to contain most of the content inside here. So the same thing that we're going to do in Webflow is create the container that's going to hold all of the content in this kind of like maximum width. And you can see it's something like 1040. So let's go ahead and create that. So I'm going to put in, I'm not going to use Webflow's native container just because they have a fixed width of 940 and we can't adjust that. So we're going to have to create our own container. I'm going to call it container, and I'm going to set the maximum width of this to 1040. And now I'm also going to hit this one, which means center this element. So now you can see we have a container in the middle that's going to make sure that our content does not extend beyond it. But of course, if our screen is going to be smaller, it's going to be smaller. So this is a good way to start. And let's see, I'm going to start off with this hero second, and I'm going to add the navigation a little bit later on, and I'll explain why in a second. So let's start with what we have here. Basically, what I see that we have here is basically two columns, like left column for text and information and right column for an image. So I can actually go ahead and use a simple grid element. I'm going to drag it in here. We don't need two rows, so I'm going to delete this row. And two columns is okay. I can actually space them out a little bit more, probably something like this. Let's do done, and let's just make sure that the naming makes sense. So Webflow automatically created grid, but let's be specific. Let's call this to call grid. We might have other grids later on. I want to make sure that this one has spacing, a little bit of spacing from top and bottom. So I'm going to hold the Option key and drag a little bit from the margin top and bottom, around 100 pixels. And now let's drag information. So first of all, it's a good time to go ahead and upload all of our assets. So let me go ahead and upload everything here. And basically within a grid column, if I want to have multiple elements, I'm going to need a div block to wrap them all together, to group them all together. Otherwise, it's going to open up multiple grid rows. So let's put one div block over here. This is going to wrap all of our content, and let me copy and paste that, and this is going to wrap our image. So I'm actually going to call this, let's call this text or content wrapper, because it's going to hold all the content, and this is going to be image wrapper. So for the image wrapper, I can just go ahead and already drag the image right here. And actually, do you see it wasn't put inside of the image wrapper, so now it added another row here, but I want the image to be inside the image wrapper. So right now it's inside, and that's going to give me the ability to later manipulate it if I want to. And inside of the content wrapper, let's see what we have. So first of all, we have this big heading here, which is H1, the main heading, 87 pixels. So let's drag it. So let's bring in a heading here from the add panel, put it inside here. And let's start styling it. And I'm not going to add a class to it. I'm going to edit the all H1 heading. So if we have that again on a different page, it's going to have this same style. And what was it? It was like 80 or something like this. 87, actually. 87. Let's copy the text so that we can see if it looks good. Obviously, the line height is too small. So the line height here, let's go ahead and edit the H1 again. Let's put 100% because that's what we have in Figma. And that looks good, but the capitalization is not good. So we want this under more type option. We want this one, capitalize every word, which is sentence capital. This looks good. So we have the heading already. Let's go ahead and bring in kind of a text paragraph. So I'm going to drag in a paragraph from here. This looks good. However, you can see here that this is actually a shorter paragraph just because we wanted to break a little bit nicer and not just like a super long line and then a second one. So let's add a class to this and call this short p. And make sure that the maximum width of this paragraph is not more than maybe 400 pixels. Yeah, this looks a little bit better. Like the typography is buying and selling. All right, so this looks a little bit better. And now we have two buttons. So let's go ahead and drag one button. Let's get started with the first one and give it a class of button. Now let's see how this button looks like. First of all, it has this buy NFTs, which we can paste here, buy NFTs, which is capital letters. We can see that it's capital letters, and we can see that the letters are spaced out a little bit, and we have this background color for the button. So let's go ahead and start styling this. So under typography, let's go ahead and capitalize this. Let's also go ahead and add a little bit of letter spacing, and I'm just going to click the up arrow until I think this looks fine, and I think maybe 1 pixel looks great. We want to have the background color, so I'm going to paste the color right here. And I want to have these round corners. So under border radius, if I'm going to drag this all the way, it actually looks not bad if I'm dragging it all the way. Usually I just randomly hit 100 pixels and it usually works well. Now, in terms of sizing, we do need a little bit more padding. So again, I'm going to hold the Option key when I drag here just so that it adds the spacing symmetrically on both sides. And I'm going to do the same here. And I want to have a little bit more spacing from the top, so I'm going to add a margin. So that's going to push the whole button. So this looks pretty good. And now I'm going to copy and paste this and add a little bit of right margin as well. And it's going to be much easier to make this button just a variation on this button instead of just creating a button from scratch. So I'm going to add a combo class. Let's call this ghost button, because that's how you call these buttons that have no, they don't have a background. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the background and just going to add a border. But we need the border to be in this teal color. So let's copy the color from here. Let's add the border. And let's change the color to this teal. So that was pretty easy, right? This one is going to be sell NFTs. So now we have 2 buttons. And yeah, so basically the only thing I think I would like to do here is, and by the way, I can see that I didn't design the buttons exactly like in the Figma file, probably in terms of spacing and stuff like that, but I'm just eyeballing it right now to move pretty quickly. Now, here's what I wanted to show you. I want to add this navigation bar, and I'm usually using Webflow's native navigation bar because it already has this hamburger menu on mobile, and that saves me a bunch of time. So I'm going to take this and drag this even here inside the hero section. Now by default, Webflow creates this very ugly, background color, which we're going to remove. But what I really wanted to show you is that this nav bar, the default nav bar from Webflow, comes inside of a container, but it comes inside of the Webflow's native container. So you can see what the problem is, right? Their container is smaller than our container, and so it's not going to align. So we actually have to replace their container. You can see already, if I'm holding it, that the text here, their container is just smaller than ours. So what I want to do is I want to create a new container, and I'll do that just by dragging a div and giving it a class of our container. You can see now that it's bigger. And I'm just going to open this up and start moving all the content. So this brand, this is where the logo is going to come in, this nav bar, and this menu button. I'm just dragging it over, and once I did that, I can go ahead and click delete this old container, and now you can see that the new navigation is going to align just nicely with our design. So now let's go ahead and design this. We'll start off by adding the class of navbar, and removing the ugly gray background. Second thing, I'm going to add inside of this brand link the logo that we have here. So we have this crypto logo, and I'm just going to drag it directly. Sometimes it's much easier to drag things in the navigator than trying to drag them inside the screen because yeah, it's just easier to move them into the right direction. By the way, I don't know, I want to give it a little bit of spacing, so let's go ahead and give this logo, let's call this main logo. Let's give it a class so that we can give it a little bit of margin from the top. And that looks pretty good. Now we want to style these as well. So let's call this nav link and go ahead and click the white so that it's white. And what else? It's also bold or semi-bold, and it's capitalized letters. So let's choose here semi-bold or medium. Let's do uppercase. So that looks good. Instead of applying the class to these two other links, I'm just going to delete these and copy paste multiple times. And then we have about pricing and contact. So about pricing and contact. Now the last button that we have here is kind of unique. It looks a little bit different. So, and actually it's not going to be easy. I can't duplicate this and create this button. And the reason is we have this kind of a circle here, a little dot. So I'm going to have to create a new element here, right? Because if I can only edit the text here, I can't put anything inside of this text link. So to do that, I'll drag a new link block and here, and let's call this nav call to action, CTA. All right. So inside of this, I need to add two elements. Number one is the text buy NFTs. That's easy, right? So let me drag a little bit of a text block inside of this. Let's call this buy NFTs. Buy NFTs. And we're going to style this in a second. The second thing I need is I need another div block that I can turn into a circle, right? I don't need to bring in an icon. That's pretty easy to create a normal div block, give it a background color and a lot of round corners to make it look like a circle. So that's what I'm going to do. So let me bring this in. Let's just take a normal div block, put it inside here. Let's call this little circle. And let's take the color from here and also look at the sides of this. So this is 17 pixels wide in height. So let's start with the size. Let's go here and make it 17 by 17. Let's give it a background color. Let's paste this background color. So now we have a little rectangular. And then but just by adding a bunch of corner radius, like 100%, it's turned into a circle. So now we have the circle and we have a text. We can start giving style to this nav call to action. Let's see what is the background color that we have here. So we have this background color. So let's go ahead and give this link div background color. Let's turn the text into white text. We don't want this underline, which is by default for anything linkable. So let's remove the text decoration. We also want the text to be uppercase, right? So uppercase, that looks great. We also want a little bit of padding here and round corners to this. So let's go ahead and do 100 pixels corner radius. But now we have a problem here, right? We want these two elements to be one next to each other and not one on top of the other. And Webflow by default, because this is, you can see here, this is a block element. It's trying to take up the whole row. So this is the first use case where we'll start using a Flexbox, and we'll be using a lot of Flexbox because this is just so, such a great tool. Basically what a Flexbox does, I'm going to give it to the main call to action wrapper. It's how do you organize the elements that are inside of it. So by doing that, I can now say I want them to stack horizontally or vertically. In this case, I do want them to stack horizontally. And I also want a little bit of spacing between them. So I have this gap. Let's turn this into a 15, maybe even 10 pixels gap between the elements. And that looks pretty good. I also want them to align centered. So this looks pretty good. But the thing is, now this whole Flexbox element is trying to take up the whole row of this element. It's inside of the nav menu. So it opened up a new row, which is not what we want. So let's go into the nav bar. Let's call this nav menu and turn that one into a Flexbox because we want to organize all of these elements and we want all of them to stack horizontally. So now we have, this one looks pretty good. The only thing is I want to space them out a little bit, so I'm going to add a gap. So now I've used Flexbox twice, one to organize this nav bar call to action, and then again to organize the whole nav menu, and you can see how useful the Flexbox is already. The only thing is that we probably want to give it a little bit of a top margin because we don't want this button to be all the way to the top. So 15 looks great. And now this one needs a little bit more spacing here to make sure that it looks like it's aligned. So now we have the navigation and we have the first section. Let's go ahead and continue into the next section, which is this featured section. Let's go ahead and create that. So we're going to do, now I can start collapsing and just to organize what we have here. So we're going to do the same thing that we did before, which is a section. Let's call this featured section. And inside the featured section, you know, we always need a container. So we already have a class for that, container. And now we have this class, which as you can see, subheader. We're using this class a lot throughout the website. So let's create a class here that's called subheader. So I'm going to take a text element and give this a class of subheader. And what do we have here? It's basically, I think, let's see what the style is. It's 20 pixels, semi-bold, uppercase. So let's go here, change to 20 pixels, semi-bold, uppercase. Okay, and let's do here as featured on. I think we can also open up the letter spacing a tiny bit, like 1 pixel. So that looks great. So now what we have here, we basically have an element here that is basically holding together all of these logos. And you can see that this element is a little bit transparent because you can see it, the gradient from the background, and we'll deal with the background in a second. So you can see this is basically purple with 19% of opacity. So let's take this, and it also has a little bit of round corners. So let's go ahead and create this. We'll take a normal div block inside of the container here, and let's call this logos wrapper because it's going to hold the logos. Let's give it a little bit of space from top to bottom so it's not too tight to the featured on. Let's give this a background color. And we also know that the background color needs to have a reduced opacity. So if I'm clicking here on the color, I can reduce the opacity here. And we know that it was about 20, right? So somewhere along these lines, also had a little bit of round corners. So I'm going to come here. Let's try 5 pixels of round corners. Looks okay. I'm already going to go ahead and give it a little bit of padding on the inside. So, because we're going to put logos, and obviously we don't want the logos to, you know, touch the edges of this thing. So, and I can, you know, see maybe around 20 pixels, which is what I did, right? Great. So next we want to put in the logos inside. So let's go ahead. We have the logos in here. I can just start dragging them here. So this is Forbes, and I'm going to hit this is high definition, so that because we've exported them at 2x, clicking this image is high definition is going to make them smaller in size, and that will make them look good on Retina screens. So I'm just going to throw them in, and one more, and more. We have one more. Okay. So now that we have them, first of all, they're just stacked one next to each other, which is not what we want, right? We want them to be spaced out equally with equal space between them. And this is going to be another fantastic opportunity to use the Flex box to organize everything inside of this div block. So let's turn it into a Flex box. I don't know why, but by default, it's this stretch. So it's trying to stretch all of these logos, but I'll just align them to the center. And in the justification, I'm going to go ahead to maybe, yeah, this looks good. So this is equal spacing, space around. And this looks fantastically well. I'm going to add, yeah, so this looks actually pretty good. The only thing is you can see that the opacity here is really reduced. And we can go ahead, so let's call this featured logo. Let's give this a class, and in the class we can go ahead and reduce the opacity to something like 50. This looks good, and then we will be able to also create this nice interaction that maybe when we hover on top of it, it becomes white and it's easier to see. So let's apply this class featured logo to all of these. Featured logo, it's great in Webflow. I can just type in the first 3 letters and then it will suggest and I'll pick it, and that's great. So because we've mentioned hover interaction, let's actually tackle the hover interactions. So with this one, it's going to be pretty easy. We're going to go here into the selector of the class and click it into the hover state. And in the hover state, we're just going to bring the opacity back to 100. So that's super easy. And now I can already preview this. If I'm just hovering on top of them, they switch into 100% opacity. So that is great, but it's a little harsh, the transition. So let's add a transition so that it would smoothly fade into white color. And the way that we do this is we pick the class in the normal state, in the non-state. We go down here into transition and we select the property that we want to animate. Now by default, this is opacity, and this is great because that's the opacity. That's the property that we're animating. I'm gonna turn this into 350 milliseconds just so it's slower and nicer to see. And now you can see when I'm hovering on top of it, it's kind of fading slowly, and that's a much nicer interaction. We can go ahead and create the same kind of hover interaction over here. So let's pick the hover, and let's say what would happen, when we click this. Maybe it will change the color into this teal color. So let's change the color here into a teal color, and then also probably the text color is going to have to change into black. So one more nice thing about Webflow, I can just type here black, and that's changing. Okay, so now we have defined the hover state, and that's nice, but we should probably fade or add the transition as well. So going back to the non-state of the button, I'm gonna go here into transition. Now we didn't change opacity, but we did change background color. So I'm gonna turn that 350. And one more was the text color. So text font color. All right, also 350. Let's see how that looks. That looks great. Now, noted what happened here, because the ghost button is a subset of the button. It's inheriting this changing of the text color to black, but it does not inherit the transition of the background. And that's because we've overridden the background here and we removed it. So I'm going to select the ghost button, go into the hover state and pick, maybe I also want here the teal color, and then going back here. So now we have transition for this button, both of these buttons, and that works well. So now we've created these nice interactions. Now, as long as we're here, actually, let's go ahead and talk about this background that we have here. So we have, as you can see here throughout the website, we have these gradient. It's basically just circles that are blurred, very, very blurred, but it creates kind of like a nice feeling in the background here. So how are we going to do that? Let's think about this for a second. Now, we can create big circles and blur them in Webflow, and I think this can be a good strategy. We don't need to bring an image or something, but the problem is that we need to put them behind the background, right? And if we're gonna add, the fact is Webflow does not work like Figma in the sense of layers, right? So these things just stack one after another, not one behind. So in order to put something behind here on the page, we're actually going to have to start dealing with positioning and positioning of absolute, and I'll explain why, because this is how we're going to add the layer property, which is in Webflow in HTML development is called Z-index. So to do that, I'm going to have to define what is the kind of, let's say, layer stack of everything. So let's put all of the content inside of a kind of a wrapper so that we can define that this is going to be higher than the background, right? So let's start stacking these together. And this concept is going to become clear in a second. Let's call this page content wrapper. Now, in the position here, I'm going to change this into relative, And by changing the position into relative, this gives me access to this property here, which is Z index. And I'm going to give it just a random Z index of 3, just so that when I'm going to create another wrapper here, which is I'm going to call background, let's call this BG gradients. This one, we're going to give this as a lower Z index. So let's go here and turn this into an absolute position. Now, by turning this into an absolute position, what this is going to do is it's going to make sure that this does not come after this, but it's actually taking this out of the normal stacking and putting it relatively to the body. And I'm going to do full, and now you can see that it's just taking up the whole space. However, I'm going to change the Z index into 1. So basically now this takes up exactly the space of the other element, but behind it. And now let me show you what is going to happen when we're going to add these circles. So let's go ahead and add a div block here into this BG grads. And let's call this big circle. I don't know, what is the size of this thing? So let's say it's 600 by 600, and it has these purple color and to radius color of 100%. So now you can see that it's just happening in the background. Now, mind you, let me just go ahead and change this. If this wasn't position absolute, if this was just static, this would all just happen afterwards, like it's the next section. So that's where position absolute becomes very, very effective for us to create layers and stack them one on top of the other. Now this big circle, we also want to blur the hell out of it. So let's go here into filters, blur, and just give this a really high number. So 100 pixels. This looks pretty good. Maybe I just want to reduce the opacity a tiny bit. And now I just want to move it kind of like outside a little bit. So I'm going to also turn this big circle into an absolute element. And now I can, tell it stick to this corner, to the top corner or top right corner. And I can actually drag it a little bit kind of like outside, which is basically what we have here, right? So this one looks okay. I can push it a little bit. You can see that maybe I can turn down the opacity a tiny bit more. Okay, so we have this background circle. Let's add another one. Let's add this one. Grab the color. What I'm going to do is simply duplicate this big circle. But by default, it's in the same place, right? So that's why it became stronger. And I'm going to just duplicate the class. So I'm going to call this big circle 2. And on this one, I'm going to change the color to the teal. Let me paste the color. Oh, did not copy the color. So copy that. Going back here, change the color. And I'm going to change, the location. So let's move this here into the top right corner. Let's drag this a little bit of it outside and pull this a little bit down. Now you can also see that the fact that this is transparent is really nice because you can see the color kind of coming back from the background. All right, so this looks kind of nice right now, right? So we have the background and we have the first two sections. So I can go ahead and start building the next sections, but first I think let's take a minute to make sure that this is responsive before we go ahead and continue to the next sections. If we're making sure that this is responsive right now, it's going to make things later on also easier for us to manage. So let's go ahead and click the next break section, which is the tablet. Immediately we see that this is horrible. The first thing that's completely horrible is that we have no spacing whatsoever between the edges of the screen. So this is where it's actually very important to make sure that on your section, each one of your section has a little bit of padding. So I'm going to call this section padding, And this is going to be a class that I apply to every single section that we have. And so let's add a little bit of, let's say 10 pixels of padding on both sides. And now you can see, well, it's probably not enough. So maybe let's turn this into 25. All right, so this is good, but we have to apply this to this section here as well. So featured section, let's call this section or padding, section padding. Well, I can't apply this because I did not create it as a global class. So let me just remove this and just add a normal div, just a random div here, and call this section padding. This would make sure that I can later apply this to any div block that I want. So let's go here and see section padding. I have this, and I can go here into featured section and also section padding. Now I have this, and I can reuse this over and over again. So this is nice. Now we have the padding. Next thing is make sure that the hero text, all of the texts are a little bit smaller as we're going down. This makes sense. I wonder if we should break this into one column, but we should probably do this later on. We do have a lot of space here in the grid, which on tablet here we can definitely close. So this looks better. Here we definitely need to make these logos smaller. So featured logo, I'm going to give this max width of maybe just 100 pixels. Yeah, now they are smaller. I can even make them a little bit bigger. So this looks better now. Buttons are too big. Maybe we can make 16, and maybe we can make, a little bit of, let's say they are okay. We can't stack them one next to each other because there's not enough space here. But this is okay. And I think as we'll go down here, here on the mobile, we'll definitely remove this column. And this looks much better, but I want the image to come before the text. So this is where it's really great that we've created this image wrapper. And we can go here, you can see that we have grid children options because this is still a grid. So we can change the order of this element, the image wrapper, into first. And also add a bunch of padding from all sides to make sure that it's a little bit smaller, or actually just reduce the size by giving it padding from left and right so the image is a little bit smaller. Yeah, this looks great. We can also reduce the margin that we gave here on top and bottom. And let's see how this looks on mobile. Well, on mobile we have now too much padding. Let's go ahead and also change the size here. Okay. And I would also go into just the main body and change. Why do I have a class of body? I didn't intend for this to happen. So this is what happens when you forget to click this body and make sure that you're editing the body alt tags. And if you're just starting to add, then Webflow by default will create extra classes. Then you have to remember to apply this class. And this is something that we're trying to avoid. So just make sure that you're actually adding the body alt tags. What I wanted to do was to make sure that the text, the normal text on all the pages, is smaller as we're going into mobile. Here we can definitely see this one should also probably be smaller here. This definitely does not work as we're trying to stack them, here. So let's go ahead and first of all allow the children to wrap. Also add a little bit of space between them, right? So this is okay, I guess. Maybe I would make them, a little bit smaller, the logos. Okay, so this looks better now. Okay, so we've created these sections. Again, I'm gonna have to go into the body and make sure that the white text is applied to body. All right, this did not apply because I've now created the style on mobile. So styles do not cascade, up into bigger breakpoint, but down into smaller breakpoints. Okay, so now we have this. This looks great. If we wanted to, we can also create kind of like an intro animation, like a load animation. Let's create something pretty quickly. So let's say we want them to kind of like slide up, 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 stack them on, like when the page loads, this fades in, and then fades in, like 1, 2, 3. This can be kind of a nice, simple intro animation. So I'm going to go here into the interaction and add a page trigger of when page loads. Now, if we would have kind of a loading animation, the right thing would be to animate things when all the page finished loading, but since we are not building right now a preloader and stuff like this, let's animate this when the page actually starts loading. So let's do start an animation, and we're going to call this, let's say, intro animation. All right, so what do we want to animate? Basically, we want to animate, let's take the container of all of this, so all of the content wrapper, we want to animate this one. So let's start off by choosing its opacity and hiding it by reducing the opacity and setting it up as an initial state. So it will start off invisible and then we'll animate them into visibility. So actually, let's go ahead and duplicate this, bring back the visibility. So now if I'm going to play this, you can see that it's animating in with a duration of ½ second. Let's also animate it, from the bottom up. So let's add another, let's do move, transform, and let's move it down a little bit. Let's see if, I'm moving it down, let's say 80 pixels down. And again, setting this as an initial state. So it starts off a little, a little off the page, and then I'm going to put it here just to make sure that it's inside of the initial state, and I'm going to duplicate this, and it's going to move up into a 0 state, so into its original position. So it's moving 80 pixels up, and right now you can see that they are first the opacity, it's going to animate the move, and then it's going to animate the opacity. I want them to happen together. So I'm dragging it on top of it, and now these two properties are going to animate together. Let me play this. Now we can see this is happening, and this is pretty nice. Probably be nicer if we change the movement from a linear animation into something like, out quad or something like this, so that it's starting fast and then slowing down. This looks a little bit like a more natural animation. So this is pretty nice. The only thing we want to do is duplicate this to this element and maybe this whole container as well. So let's see if we can select this whole thing and duplicate it. But what I want to do is I want to change for the ones here that we have duplicated. Let's go ahead and change the target into this image wrapper. Okay, so now we have duplicated the same thing. We've hidden the image wrapper, and we're going to set this as an initial state. We moved it, so it didn't duplicate the move 80 pixels down. So let's change this to 80 seconds down. Okay, so now it's hidden and moved into the bottom, and we can duplicate the end state as well. So let's duplicate these, and let's change the target into, I'm going to select here the image wrapper. So let's play this and see what happens. Okay, so now, wait a second, I think. Yeah, I've duplicated, so it's hidden, and then I don't know why it's here, so let's delete this. We've got hidden, and then this one is playing, and then this one is playing. Let's play this and see what happens. Number 1, number 2. Okay, so this is okay. We can also do this for this featured section, but for now this is enough. So now we have this loading animation. Let's save this. And you can see if I'm previewing this, it's animating in. Actually, the correct thing would be to animate this as well, because it's kind of weird that you're starting off, you see the featured, but you don't see the hero. So let's go ahead and do this quickly as well. So I would select the whole container here. So actually, let's go ahead and pick these ones. The first state where it's hidden and a little bit down. Let's duplicate these. Also set them in initial state and change the target to this container. And let's go ahead and duplicate the end state and change the target to this container. And let's see what we have now. Okay, so now they are all staggered together. Okay, so this is quite a nice intro animation. 1, 2, 3. Now this looks good. 1, 2, 3. All right, great. Let's save the interaction. So we have the hero section, we have the featured section. We can move on into the next sections, and the next sections are going to be so easy. Why? Because these are 2 columns and they actually look not very far from what we have here. So I'm just going to, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate it. So we have the hero section. Let me go ahead and duplicate the hero section, copy and paste. Now we don't need the navigation again. That's obvious. I'm going to delete that. Let's change the name here. From hero section, let's duplicate this and call this benefit section, just for organizational structure. We can change we can also see that the image here comes first, right? So that's going to be very easy to change. All we have to do is bring the image before the content. So now this one is on the left. Let's go ahead and change the image. Boom. So that was easy. Okay, size is good. This one is actually smaller. This one is not H1. This is built-in analytics. Is actually H2, which is 57. So let's go ahead and click here, the settings of the heading, and change this to H2. But we didn't style H2 yet. So I'm going to click here and edit all H2s. Going to put here 57. Let's give this 100%. This looks okay. Also going to make sure that this has the capitalization. And no, but we wanted built-in analytics. And we also have this analytics thing here, which we actually know this is like featured on, right? So let's bring in a text. Let's paste here the analytics. Let's give this the subheader class, which we already have, but this one is teal. So let's add a combo class. Let's call this teal, and just make sure, let's copy the color from here, the teal color. And now we have this combo class. Let's add it to the text color, paste teal. By the way, this would be probably a good approach to, because we're reusing the color, would be a good, use for a global class, and we can call this teal. Is teal the right name for this color? I do not know. And now we have this swatch that we can reapply over and over again. That would be a better kind of like way to work around. We don't need this, and we have a different button here. But overall, this section is created. Now, one thing that is not looking well is that the image and the text here are not nicely aligned. And one thing that I can do is when I'm clicking on the content wrapper here, I can go ahead and make sure that it is centered aligned with the grid element. So now this looks much better. And yeah, I can actually go ahead and copy and paste this and change this again. Change the image again to the last section. I'm not going to change the text because, you understand how to change the text. So that's easy. So we basically have these 2 sections done in like 2 seconds or 2 minutes. All right, great. Let's continue. Let's see what we have here. So now we have a different section, which is centered. So we didn't have that one yet. So let's go ahead and create that. I'm going to collapse a bunch of things here just so that we can see what we're doing. Let's add a new section below the benefit section. Let's call this testimonial section. And inside of it, of course, going to add a container. Okay, container, which we have. But one thing that we do know, so we have another one of these subheaders, right? So we can go ahead and copy the subheader inside, and we have another H2 which we can copy another H2 inside, but we do need them to be centered. So let's go ahead and add the container, a combo class, call it center. And the only thing I'm going to change here is basically this text alignment here. I'm going to change it into centered. This looks great. I can go ahead and write here testimonials. That's great. I can go ahead and take this, what others have to say. What others have to say. Now they broke the line here. They broke it down. So I can actually call this short H2, and set a limit to the max width. So maybe something like 400 pixels, maybe a little bit more. Okay, so now we can see that they are not centeredly aligned. Although the text is centered, the elements are not centered. So in this center class, let's actually change it into a flex. But this flex is not going to be horizontal. It's going to be vertical, and just want to make sure that they are aligned to the center. Now this looks great. And now we have basically a grid with 3 card elements. So let's go ahead and add another grid here. And no, we do not want this to be 2 columns. Let's add another one, and we don't need a second row. So let's delete the row. And let's call this not a grid. Let's rename this to 3 call grid. And what do we want? First of all, we want this to expand throughout the section. And I can see that, this flex box that we have created here. Well, actually, let's just add width 100%. And yeah, now it's taken up the whole space. And let's add a little bit of top and bottom margin. And let's go ahead and create this card. So what is this card? Let's see, what is this card? It's a white card with 8% of opacity and round corners. So let's add here, and I'm just going to create one of them because it's going to be very easy to copy and paste. Let's call this card wrapper. And let's start off by giving this a white background color with 8 opacity. It's very thin. Let's pull it to 10. Let's give it a radius corner of maybe 10 pixels. Gonna give it a little bit of padding because obviously we always need padding to make sure that the content does not stick. So now we have basically the card element, and within it we have an image, and then this one is actually a subheader, so we have the class for that. And then we also have this normal text. So let's go ahead and drag. Basically, I can drag an image here. Make sure this is high definition. I can go ahead and also maybe copy and paste here her name. And then we are going to have a normal paragraph in here. Okay, so this is okay. We don't need the teal here, by the way. So this is white. In this wrapper, we do want them spaced out. So again, an easy way to start spacing them out is if we turn this into a flex box, not an horizontal flex box, so a vertical stacking flex box that is centered. And now we have gap. So let's add a gap between these elements. So this is okay. Basically, we have what we need here. But here's an interesting thing that's happening. Note the image here is not full color. And this is because the layer is set to luminosity blending mode. So it's getting the color from the background. Now, we can change that. And actually, Webflow does have blending modes here. So I can go ahead and give this a blending mode. However, I can change this, and you'll see what happens if I change this to luminosity. Nothing happens because Webflow, for some reason, does not allow the blending modes to apply to images. So I'm actually going to undo this. And the way that I'm going to create this effect is actually apply the color on top of it with the blending mode. So let me show you how I'm going to do this. I'm going to put the image inside of a wrapper. Let's call this test image wrapper and put the image inside of it. And now basically what I need is I need a color overlay on top of it. So probably this purplish color that we have been working with, something like this color. And how do I create an overlay on top of the image? If you've been following along the way that we've been doing the background, that you know I'm going to have to use something like position absolute. So let's go ahead and let's call this test color overlay. Overlay. And let's give this the color of, this purple. And let's go ahead and change the wrapper into a relative, position relative. Whenever I'm going to use absolute position, I need the parent of that element. In this case, this is going to be absolute. And I want this to be overlay and fill up this whole test image wrapper, right? So in order to do that, this one needs to be a relative. Otherwise, when I'm going to go ahead and change this into absolute, it's going to be relative to something else. So now it's relative to its parent because I've made the parent relative. And now I can also click this, and now you can see it's on top of it. And this color overlay, we can go down here and start playing with these blending modes. And now you can see I can actually try to find a similar effect. Actually, the similar effect I think is color. But now we have another problem, which is where the effect is on the whole rectangular. So let's turn this color overlay into a circle by giving this a crazy radius like 100%. And ba-bam. So now we fake this. Again, this is built a little bit differently from how this was created in Figma, but we've reproduced this with a little bit of a different trick. And of course, now that we have this card wrapper, we can just 1, 2, 3, duplicate it 3 times. Maybe we want a little bit more spacing here in the gutter, but overall, I think this looks pretty good. So we have 2 more sections, and the next section is rather easy. It's also centered, right? So we can go ahead and copy kind of the class that we have here, but it has this card gradient card thing. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and create another testimonial here. Not testimonial, sorry, another section we need. So it's going to be, what's the name of this section? Call to action, probably. Let's call this CTA section. And inside of it, we're going to have another container, and this container is also going to be centered. So I can just apply that, and let's go ahead and create the wrapper for this card element. So let's put it in the container and call this CTA wrapper, and make sure that it is 100% and it has a bunch of padding inside of it. And let's give it a gradient background color. So I'm just going to hit plus here and choose a gradient. And let's see what the colors are here. So linear background. So it's going from this teal. Let's edit the background. So from this teal into this, teal. All right, into this purplish. Let's copy this one. And okay, let's see what the size is. Here the purple is on this side, and it's kind of like, I think this angle. I'm playing around with the angle a little bit. So this looks great. And let's give it a big radius, corner radius, 20. This looks pretty solid. It's actually 30, so let's go ahead and turn this into 30. What else do we have here? We have this subheader, which here is actually black. So let's bring this in here. What is this? Are you ready? Oh, sorry. Are you ready? Let's give this subheader, and let's give this a class of black, which is going to just change the color, text color into black. Then we have just another H2, So I can just go ahead and bring another H2 here. I'm going to paste this inside. The next big thing. So if I want this to break, I can just give a bunch of padding into this call to action wrapper. This looks pretty good. And the last thing is a button, but this button is black. So let's copy this button and give this a class of black button. All we have to do is go ahead, change the background to black, and it's actually pretty good. We also have to fix up the, of course, hover, and maybe on hover it's going to be this teal color. Not the background, actually, maybe just the text is going to turn into teal. So this is subtle hover interaction. Not sure that it's perfect, but all right. So we have this section as well, and we are basically, let me give a little bit more spacing at the top as well. And the only thing we have left is the footer. So let's go ahead and create our footer section. So let me collapse these ones and let's see how we're going to create our footer section. So let's call this footer section. Footer section. Let's go ahead and add another container within it. Container. Now, let me see. Basically, what we have here is I can look at it in terms of columns. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. And I can go ahead and create a grid for it, or I can just create a flex box depending on the sizing of these, because these are not exactly they're not exactly equal spacing. Let's try to create a grid element. So let me go ahead and bring in a grid. Let's call this 5 column. So now we have 3, 4, 5, and we don't need this other row. But this one, the last column, you can see here is a little bit, maybe it's even 6 columns, but the last one is spanning 2 on, so I can either make this like 2 times bigger than the rest, which I think this is what we're going to go with. And I'm going to rename this for the sake of cleanliness, 5 call grid. Fantastic. So now I can go ahead and start bringing, so we have here the logo, which I can go ahead and just copy and paste here. But actually, for the sake of organization, I'm going to put div blocks into all of these elements first. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to put content inside of div blocks, because if I want to manipulate it later on, it's better to just put the content within elements versus just put the actual elements within it. Here we're going to have a list of links. So we have here, first of all, kind of a title. Let's go ahead and put this here. We can call this crypto. Actually, for the sake of organization, let's use subheader, although that's not the actual class that we have here. And then a list of links. So the right way to build this would probably be to use like a list. So put a list inside here. In this case, we don't need bullets, but we do have kind of like list items inside, and inside of them, we're going to just take text links and put them here inside of the list and go ahead and style them. So let's call this footer link, and make sure that it's white. Does this one has an underline? No. No underline, so no underline, no underline. A little bit of spacing. Actually, the spacing should be done on footer item. So this is an item from the list, and give it a little bit of spacing. So now we have one item. I can duplicate this multiple times, and actually this whole div block we can just duplicate that, right? Because it's pretty much the same thing 3 times, right? So let's go ahead and duplicate this. Now we probably don't need to have this spacing on the top here. So main logo, let's call this footer logo, just because we want to get rid of this top margin. So we have these links here. Now we have this join our newsletter, which is actually bigger than the rest of the text that we have here. So let's go ahead and let's copy this, and let's do here join our newsletter. Let's change this from subheader. Let's call this newsletter. This is actually a class that we don't have repeating throughout the website, so let's just give it a random class, maybe medium. So this looks pretty good. Give it a little bit of spacing from the bottom. And now we have this newsletter, basically a mini form with an email address and this submit button. So let's go ahead and create this. So what I'm going to do is just grab a form element, form block, and put it here. Now it comes with a lot of things that we don't necessarily need. So name we don't need here, and even a label, although a label is a good practice, this design does not have it, so I'm going to delete this. And here inside of the text field, if I'm going to go here into the settings, we can go here and put some placeholder text like email address. So we have that inside here. Now, how are we going to go ahead and make this look like this? Well, first thing is it's already sitting within a wrap, right? Within a wrapper that's called form and has a text field and has the button. So let's just basically go ahead and design this form element. Let's give it a class and call this form wrapper. And well, how do we put these one next to each other? First thing, we've done this multiple times using the Flex box, including a little bit of a gap between them. That looks pretty good. We also need a background color here. So let's grab this background color and give a little bit of a background color here. What else do we need? We need to have round corners, like a lot of it. So let's go ahead and add 100 corner radius, but we're also going to have to apply this to what we have inside. Let's see the button. The button is actually pretty similar to buttons that we already have. Let's see what happens if I apply button. Okay, this looks good, but it has too much spacing here, and so let's create a variation on this using a combo class. Form button. So this is when reusing styles becomes very easy. So now by adding the right spacing from top, bottom, and right corner, and I didn't do this super accurately, but we can see that it looks good, but this button is too big. Let's go ahead and make the text a little bit smaller. Let's add the padding that we have here. It can be a little bit smaller. Okay, so button looks good. Let's design this text field. So let's call this form field, and let's give us a little bit of spacing. And what do we need to do? So first of all, get rid of this background color. So background, nothing. It also has this, this border. So I'm going to go here and do border 0, 0 so that we don't have any border. And maybe change the text to white, although it looks like it's white, but I'm going to select it as white, just so that when I'm going to preview this and somebody's going to type in here, no, this actually looks pretty good. So this was easier than I thought. All right, so we have our 5-column grid here. Let's add a little bit of spacing at the bottom so that we can create this last thing that we have here, which is this gradient thing that goes all the way. We already have this gradient color, so maybe instead of recreating this gradient, maybe we can use this wrapper. Nah, let's just recreate this. So after the footer section, because this footer already has a container, and we want this to span all the way. And usually, by the way, everything else that we have, we didn't apply it, but you will remember that for the first sections, we did apply section padding so that things do not touch the edges. And we will have to go back and apply this to all the new sections that we have created here. But the last thing, I do not want, like this gradient, we want this to really go edge to edge. So let's actually go ahead and recreate this as the last section, which we will not apply this padding to. So I'm going to call this footer gradient, and just going to make it like a 10 pixel height, 10 pixels, not XP, maybe 15 for the sake of it. And let's go ahead and copy the gradient that we have here. So I'm just going to copy this, go here, add a gradient color, paste this one here. Let's go ahead and copy the other color, this one, gradient, bam, this one, make sure that nope, it did not paste. All right. Yep. So now the gradient is actually in place. So now we have basically finished creating the page. Now there are some more details. We can create a little bit more circles here and make sure that everything is responsive. But overall, we are done. So this walkthrough has been a fairly simple build of a simple landing page. And if you're interested in learning more, if you're interested in a more complex layout in how to add CMS and interactivity and other integrations into your website, I do encourage you to take a look at our full Webflow masterclass. This is a full-on 12-hour program where we dive deep into Webflow and how to build websites for your client. You're welcome to check that out in the description below. And I will see you on the next video. Peace out.